here, it's Rob Hetherington for episode 2 of the Future Experience Project. I'm here with Brian Leung from ICON. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you for coming over from a really important conference that you felt this is far more exciting to be on. So that is a really good start.
Yes.
So thank you. But no, really great you're here. As with all Future Experience Projects podcasts, we want to explore all the really cool things that humankind has done in design, in the public realm and recreation. We look back to the past to see what was great, and we look forward to see what's next. So here, with your current ICON headspace and everything that we're doing in the UAE. But first things first, you chose to get into the theory of landscape architecture and had an amazing time in the UK before you came over here. So I want to hear about why you came over here, but first things first, getting into landscape architecture.
Yeah. Well, getting into landscape was an interesting experience. I think when I was younger, I grew up in Hong Kong, which most people see as a very dense, packed city full of skyscrapers, maybe not a lot of open space. But actually, Hong Kong is around 80% of it is open space. So natural, kind of parks, nature reserves, hiking trails, and you just have to step outside the city a bit. And when I grew up, my parents actually had a place in the New Territories, which is a relatively rural part of Hong Kong. So where I grew up, I actually didn't see that many skyscrapers, and I was exposed to more open spaces, landscape and public realm and things like that. So I think that, maybe somehow subconsciously impacted me and kind of drove me to that kind of field. Then I went to the UK to study.
Sorry, man, what age was that?
So I was in Hong Kong till I was about 17, and then I moved to the UK for university, and then I worked there for about 7 or 8 years before moving out to Dubai.
So you're grounding your experience of growing up in rural Hong Kong. That's really mountainous. I can imagine that,
Yes.
In European mindsets, a lot of it will be about whether it's near a town or in cities, it's lots of flat spaces and maybe some rolling hills. But in Hong Kong, it's skyscrapers and skyrocket mountains. So
exactly. So Hong Kong Island is a lot like that. So in the more rural parts, there was more kind of flat open spaces, but there was, we could see mountains, and then across the border, we could see from my parents' bedroom window into China, into Shenzhen. So it's quite an interesting experience growing up there.
Crazy. Have you been there back since Shenzhen's been growing up and become huge? The
last time I went was in 2004, I think. So it's quite a long time ago, but it has grown exponentially since. And it's just amazing because before, when I was a child, looking out the window, you see, that beyond the hills, beyond the mountains, okay, that's Shenzhen, that's in China. And then now it's, seeing the skyscrapers, and at nighttime, it's all very lit up. So it's it's completely changed.
It's fascinating. So it was the outdoors and the landscape, not the buildings. I mean, you could have gone either way, right? So there was
exactly.
There was always going to be a designer. Which way?
Yes, and I think when I studied at university, well, the first year was actually taught with the architects. So the first year, landscape and the architecture students were taught together. So there could have been a switch. I could have been an architect, maybe. But no, I ended up, I stayed the course with landscape, and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the field of study, understanding about, what landscape is actually about, not just the kind of leftover spaces from, the buildings. So it's more about that wider urban kind of infrastructure, all of the open spaces, how they network together.
Is that how design courses have been forever, whereby it's usually a case of general design in a certain field, and then you get these choices that then specialize just in the way that you described it? Or was that particularly to your...
I think that was particularly to my course. So I mean, our intake, we had 10 landscape architects in the first year, and there were about 150 architects. So it was a very, we were a very small group within the overall the year group. But I think where we were different was we were looking more holistically in terms of at a, whether that's a master plan level or a city level, where compared to looking at something at like a building kind of level.
That's it. I know we're going to come on to AI later, and we want to hear about the story, but we must remember to touch back on that with AI changing everything and everywhere in terms of how we're living our lives professionally leisure-wise. I can imagine that the holistic approach is something you really value because you've then made a choice based upon seeing some general principles holistically. I wonder if AI either allows us to be more holistic in how we get to understand design because we're not having to worry about so much the nuts and bolts of making something happen because AI is going to help us with that. Or does it do the opposite? Is it making us really narrow a field because we've really got to try and stand apart, which might mean that we're not thinking broadly about design. And that might actually affect design overall. We'll have designers that will be thinking too narrow field.
Yeah, I think from a landscape perspective, in terms of the use of AI, myself, my colleagues, we tend to use it, I think, for some kind of conceptual image generation at the moment. So it's quite good at that in terms of visualizing something quickly rather than having to model something and, really create the 3D renders. So it's good for those quick kind of initial conceptual ideas that we've got and turning them into images, so something the client can understand. But we do need to be careful in terms of vetting what is shown because it can come up with things that are not realistic or things that we know don't actually work, but AI has generated some images. So I think there's still some way to go. We don't really use AI much for the developing detailed drawings and technical things because it's not, at least in my experience of it, it's not there yet.
Yeah.
But I think, over the next 5-10 years, it will grow. It'll take a lot of the load off in terms of the grunt work, in terms of things that we don't really want to spend our time doing. And then we can then focus on the more unique elements and interesting things that we want to pursue.
Oh, I think so. I think certainly with Jabal, the amount of knowledge of what AI is going to change from a full turnkey design build company is that it's always about giving people the most amount of creative options and doing it in the quickest way possible. And that will help deliver really high quality. And for clients and architects, consultants, it's no different. It's the speed in which information can be provided that's trustworthy that ultimately allows probably an 80-20 rule. 80% of that grunt work is removed or reduced significantly. So ultimately the human power of the equation becomes the dominant factor. So ultimately, if 80% is the creative element, it will probably mean more options or more complexity within the option and not less because the time is taken doing all that grunt work. And it comes down to the data. And certainly in the exploring that Jabal has been doing for the last 3 to 6 months, it's that access to data and it's that ability of using that data. And I think a lot of this will connect up with the partnerships that will probably advance the fastest in the region will be with those that perhaps have been in the region for a while, because they will have had countless experiences of delivering great ideas or great projects or high quality finishes and have the data to do it. So I think right now, you're right, there is this, we use perhaps AI just for now in terms of the initial ideas, but that's because we're using general based data on the big systems that are just scraping certain websites. I think very quickly, the data available from those that have been in the region or have been in a country or been in a city, that's going to absolutely strengthen relationships between those companies, but it's going to accelerate the ideas, isn't it?
Yes.
We were just talking at lunchtime about some of the throw it and see what sticks to the wall ideas that come into Dubai, right? Some incredible things, and some happen, some don't. Well, I think some of those are going to stick a lot more because we're going to work out what sticks far quicker.
Yes, that ideation process and having that creativity and using AI to support that. So I think it's important that we don't let the tools like the AI and whatever determine or limit what we can do, but use it as a process or as a tool to just refine things more quickly, develop ideas more quickly. So to me, I see it as almost like the paradigm shift from back in the day when people would do drafting manually, and then shifting into AutoCAD and being able to draw things that are much more complicated, being able to save a lot of time in terms of drafting. So this is like that next step, but aiding with the creativity and ideation process.
Yeah, I think you're right. Now you're almost as old as I am, so your time in the UK was before AI. So we need to step back. So you've just entered the world of landscape architecture, and I'd love to hear about the most incredible projects you got involved with in your time in the UK before you came here. But that may have been involved with projects that were international, but based out of where you were in the UK. So
yes, so I think the journey all kind of ties in together. So when I started, I joined a company which was known as Edo at the time, which AECOM bought and then became part of AECOM. My early career was actually in resort master planning, to do hospitality projects, golf resorts, like residential communities, that kind of thing. And one of the early projects that I worked on that brought me to have this Middle East experience was actually Saadiyat Island. So at the time, I think 2007, Saadiyat, there was nothing on it. It was a relatively pristine island. You needed a boat to get to the island. There was no highway. There was no, no hotels, nothing there. And then we were involved in the master planning of it. And then...
So was that before it became a cultural island?
Yes, that was back in 2007.
Wow.
Yeah, I think, my Arabic's limited, but I think Saadiyat, if I remember correctly, is like the island of happiness. So, and at that time, being involved in the master plan, how we create these resort districts, the cultural districts, there's a marina district and various other elements. And it was really, really real privilege to be able to work on something at that scale so early on. And I think that kind of, led to more projects in the Middle East, which then influenced the decision to actually make the move over to the UAE. And I think the turning point for that was we'd worked on Saadiyat, on the master plan, which then led to working on the landscaping for the Saadiyat Expressway, which cuts through the island. And then from that, the Abu Dhabi Airports was looking for a landscape architect for, which is now, it was known as Midfield Terminal at the time, but which is now the Abu Dhabi, the Zayed International Airport. And they wanted the designer of the Saadiyat Expressway project. So we'd won that project, and then I'd moved out here to work on that. So I worked on that for about 7 years since moving out to the Middle East, from the conceptual stage with the team back in London all the way through to site supervision. So that was, I think, one of the most, influential projects in my career.
That's amazing. So how many years on that in the UK, and then how many years in delivering it? First at Saadiyat and then with the airport. So because it's a big chunk of time, but actually you've gone literally from beginning to end, which is probably quite unusual for a lot of people. Yeah.
Yes, I think it was quite unusual. But yes, Saadiyat, that project was in 2007. And then by the time we'd won the project for Abu Dhabi Airport in 2014, then I made the move in March 2015 and relocated out to the Middle East. And then I continued on that project until 2022, when the project was already pretty much constructed. It was in the final phases, and I left AECOM and I joined ICON at that time.
And so just excellent. So just before we get into the ICON era, the Saadiyat period, how developed did that area get in terms of what we now see with the Louvre, the Guggenheim is being constructed, the others? So at what point did you come off that project and there were still things that we've seen now that had not happened? Or
yeah, I think what was really interesting was back then it was very ambitious in terms of the time frame. So the client at the time had wanted everything to say, we'll get this built in the next 5 years or 5 years, 10 years, and it would all be built. And now, from 2007 till now in 2025, there's still a lot to do, but it's been amazing to actually see the museums that were part of the master plan. They are getting constructed. Things have taken a bit more time, of course, but the key components, so the resort district with the hotels, which I think started with the St. Regis, and the other hotels have been, opening over the last, 5 years, 10 years, to the cultural district. So from the Louvre, and then now the Guggenheim's under construction, and, the National Museum, Abraham Brick House, there's other elements. So it's all coming together, relatively close, I would say, to the master plan, and the other areas which are being developed for housing. And there are always changes, because of whether it's because of there's views from the developers in terms of what would be most suitable and the time frame. But I'm actually quite proud of the fact that a lot of it has stayed quite true to what was in the master plan before.
There's some amazing public realm things happening there now, and there's some amazing things that Jabal are luckily a part of. I also know that you're very passionate about sustainable outdoor living all of the time, or recreational experiences all of the time that can be sustainable, not just particularly in the Middle East at night time. And the Saadiyat, the Cool Pathway project that is well underway, that luckily Jabal are delivering and building, is incredible. But it goes hand in hand with the most incredible lighting structures and shade structures that will be part of a much bigger and longer project as these things continue. So you've got amazing indoor leisure experiences, you've got the hotel resort sectors, but it now seems also that, and I'll be interested to know if those things were even part of the inkling of ideas in terms of how the public realm and recreation is basically stitching these things together. So was there a big idea for outdoor sustainable living back then, or anything like that?
I think back then there was that kind of general idea, but not so specific, not in terms of having active kind of cooling. I think the idea is about the passive passive cooling, having that thermal comfort outdoors. So that all kind of was part of when Estidama came out as well at that time. So the ideas, I think as a general idea, it was there, but having that implemented in the detail, that's something that came a little bit later on. And what was interesting is also, for example, the Abu Dhabi airport project. So there were other designers on board before where there were different concepts, like a lush kind of English garden or other things, but then that didn't really work with Estidama coming out. So then we were looking at something that was much more of a xeriscape, natural landscape that blended in. So I think all these kind of changes at the planning or policy level then drive the design changes, which is good, I think, because in terms of design, whether it's a hospitality project, a residential project, public realm project, and the idea or the essence of it is we want to craft these spaces where people can actually enjoy and use and spend their time in. So all these considerations need to come first before I think even that design starts to form.
Are there in general, for design in general, we go from master planning stage, it seems that every 5 years, certainly with how technology and social media and the way in which we communicate and absorb information, it seems to affect public opinion, whether it's politics, economics or otherwise. Is that having an impact on master planners? So in terms of, you've got an idea for what you're trying to achieve, the airport project in this case, it could be anything, but actually by the time you get to the end, things can come to play to influence. We've just spoken about that on Saadiyat.
Yes.
But actually, are you finding more things are influencing more quickly because the world's opinion seems to be changing much quicker than it ever did? Is that impacting design philosophy on master plans?
I think that it does have an impact, and there are things that have come out, things like sponge cities and other elements that have influenced a lot of the thinking in the region as well as globally. And I think the difference in the UAE is also the leadership. It has a vision. It doesn't have politicians who may be, trying to remain elected and have their own agenda to get votes. So when there is actually a directive, from the leadership, then usually that will get implemented. And I think that's actually more steady, and it aids that speed of development where you don't have to worry as much about things taking a long time or change in the political environment. So in a way, I think that stability has actually been quite helpful in getting the vision and then getting that implemented into projects as they move forward.
That is interesting, and of course having an immense amount of projects to go with that vision sort of helps too. So it's a perfect place for landscape architecture and the budding landscape architects to come out and follow your route. So we're in the UAE, we're at Icon. Same question. I know that projects have got bigger and bolder and better, and you've had an exciting time there so far. So some highlights at your career so far with Icon.
Yes, I think so. With Icon, I've done good range of projects actually, from like public realm, highway beautification, residential development, parks. But I think in terms of highlights, one of them would be this upcoming park in Jebel Ali. So we've done that with Wassel as our client. That's currently under construction. So that will provide a very large scale open space for the upcoming development in that master plan. It's an interesting approach because it also looks at the value of landscape, because there was a previous master plan, and then with the central park. Now we've redesigned that central park, which is now under construction. So instead of some projects where all the buildings are put in place and then the park comes in at the end, this is actually utilizing the landscape as a key driver to attract investment, to attract developers to come in and say, we'll actually have a ready park. So when you come in and you build the residential buildings and so on, so this is something that will be functioning. It serves the community. Whereas some other older developments, what happened would be the developer would build all the buildings first, and then by the time the last buildings are almost in place, then they start building the open spaces and landscape. And the people who've moved in early, basically, they've been losing out because when they moved in, they didn't have any of the amenities.
Interesting. So, in short, leisure is no longer an add-on; it becomes central.
Yeah.
So, leisure or recreation and wellness, it's a leisure pursuit, whether you're relaxing or being intense about things. It's about a time and place in which you are switching off, or you're connecting up with work, and you're not at the same level. Is that enhancing now? Are you seeing that leisure and recreation is now part of the business model that's sitting? Because this sounds like either the first of its kind or something leading. Is that already changing the other projects you're starting to see? It's not buildings first and post-lesson. You're coming in much earlier as part of a business model?
Yes, I think so. And it's having that early input actually at the master planning stage. So I think landscape architects traditionally, they would come in later in the process, and there would be the master plan where the master planners have kind of achieved the goals in terms of what the client wants for the development, for the GFA, etc. Then there would be some open spaces that would be at the end, which would then be developed. But having it the other way around, taking into account, using the landscape as green infrastructure, using the landscape, to sell that, the amenities and that addition of value to the projects, actually, makes us get involved much earlier. And then there are things also where we can influence at the master planning stage in terms of the connectivity through developments, how we actually can make the spaces more useful for the residents, and also influence things like in terms of the master planning stage. If we know the buildings and so on, but the heights, then we can also look at the placement of the open spaces, creating that shade from the buildings or different elements in the master plan, which actually increases the thermal comfort, and then that also makes the spaces more usable later.
Are you finding that there is a much more bigger blur between the boundaries of indoors and outdoors? Because there is my understanding on this drive for strategy where leisure is becoming an investment criteria, not just a nice have, but actually it's more than a garden and a playground. It's something where leisure and recreation across many areas, across many age groups have to be thought of, but that also means for indoors. Are you finding yourselves getting involved in indoor strategies more and more now?
I think in terms of indoor, outdoor, so we've always had on projects, we had that relationship with the architects, with the interior designers, and understanding that kind of provision indoors, and then how we balance that with the outdoors. I think more so now than before, for sure. However, I think at the end of the day, as humans, social creatures, also that we want to spend time enjoying the outdoors. So it's making sure the outdoor spaces do cater for the different age groups. They cater for people of determination. They cater for people perhaps with strollers, with prams, or with walking difficulties. Ensuring that accessibility and inclusivity is very important. But also what I've found is, I think when I first moved out here, looking at the local culture, how people use the spaces, They'll come out more at night times, when the weather's cooler. So lighting's always been an important part of that element. But now in terms of design, we're looking at, okay, so we can, the nighttime part we can cover pretty well. We know in the winter season, that's, the outdoor spaces are great as well and usable. How do we extend those shoulder months on either end, before and after the winter, so that people can actually enjoy those spaces for longer? And we can, as landscape architects, we can design beautiful spaces, but if it's not comfortable to be in, then people won't use them. So I think it all boils down at the end of the day, how do we, create these spaces that are beautiful, functional, that encourage people to use them.
And the demand's getting stronger and stronger. So thermal comfort, sustainability.
Yes.
The growing increase of urbanization, whilst there are more islands and villas being built, it's still the density has to be covered by the more compact element of urbanization. Do you think we get to a sweet spot? And I'm sure there'll be more air-conditioned outdoor spaces, but they seem to be at a complete conflict, don't they? Thermal cooling and sustainability and everything in between. But this drive for more non-nighttime outdoor space,
yes,
is that starting to drive some really interesting innovation there in the bucket realm?
I think so. And also, one of the things, just stepping back to what I say about the master planning, getting involved early on is, like you say, about the density. So this year, the population of Dubai has reached 4 million. And then over the next, up to 2040, 2050, that projection to get up to around 8 million. So it's going to be a huge increase. And I think to be able to cater for that demand requires some creative thinking. So I was at a conference this morning. They said it's about high-rise buildings, but in relative to high-rise buildings, there's that higher density. You've got a lot more people living there. They still have open space requirements. So, and then it's about how do you create high-performing landscapes so that can cater for that increase in the population density, that can still provide a good level of service for the people who are using it. And I think one of the things is we do try and create, for example, shade in parks with trees, with shade structures and other things. But in a high density urban environment, one thing that actually is quite helpful is between skyscrapers, you will have a kind of a wind tunnel effect. So it does give a bit of cooling. And then the height of the buildings also gives good shade. So these are kind of elements that we can work together with the master planners at that early stage to have that influence and to understand the actual microclimate, how we can influence that, and where we locate the parks, where we locate different elements to make sure that they can actually be used for longer periods of the year.
There's not a UE project, but in Canary Wharf in London, UK, there's been a lot of efforts made in the last 10 years on greenifying the space, working with Eden Project and creating, at the same time, cleaning up the Thames and having it suitable for open swimming, creating quite wild spaces in what is a completely non-wild space when it comes to urban landscape and natural landscapes. But now particularly with tall buildings, the old HSBC tower, if I get it right, literally retrofitting massive chunks of space, 40, 50 stories up from that. They might cover 10 stories. So it really is an outdoor living space, but upstairs, not just necessarily an observation deck that might have some planting. It is an integration of it. Happens to be public realm, the 50 stories up. This is directly a call of urbanization, where perhaps there's a change in use of tall building, but there is not a change in demand for condensed urban living. So this takes landscape architecture to literally a whole other level, doesn't it? Where it's not just about planting in the whatever the level of atmosphere is. It's how space is used, shade, all those things you mentioned, but in a totally different mindset, right?
Yes, and I think that comes as a totally different context. But again, it boils down to people living in these dense areas. They still need their open spaces, areas they can socialize, they can relax, and so for me, I see it as it's a very positive development. something that can be integrated. There are some residential projects in Dubai at the moment which have a kind of similar approach. So trying to create, very large kind of outdoor exterior spaces on the upper levels. So something that is a landscape space for the residents, and that spans, a few levels as well. And I think this is it's a good kind of trend in a way. And if you look at, for example, NEOM, so the line, where, yes, they do have the line, but the renders internally and the way they've got different levels of landscape inside. So again, also that's kind of, I would say, a similar approach. And I think in highly urbanized areas, that is one way to try and achieve that kind of open space, to have that usability for the people who live there. If there aren't parks and open spaces nearby that are sufficient to, to cater for that population.
So the dream or vision is to grow Dubai to 8 million, but to have far less cars, right? Or at least the access points on public transport of every 800 meters. Do we get to a space where actually we can start seeing roads being turned into recreation spaces in Dubai in that next 20 years as they grow, but with technology, drones, air taxis, all of those other elements of transport which will become more normal? But there's greenifying the existing urban structure as we have it now without cars, and maybe driverless cars come into it. Is there something that could really be quite unexpected happen in 20 years, do you think?
I think in Dubai, it's a possibility. There is there are always ideas that we can think about and, see how we implement that. I think in Europe, we're seeing that a bit more already. So reducing, I guess, through the policy planning and reducing the cars that come into the city centre, taking back some of the streets and making them pedestrian only. So I think for Dubai, it is possible. There are, I'm thinking off the top of my head, for example, we have many areas where we have the bridges for the cars. Underneath those areas, they could be utilized as open spaces. So they are already shaded. They are already existing. So if we can figure out, the connectivity to those spaces, they can be programmed in a way so they could be used and contribute as open spaces for the public to use. I think as Dubai develops and then the walkability increases, then these kind of connecting spaces will become quite important as well. So as I guess the city of Dubai matures, then similar to other cities in Europe or that are looking at that same process now, it's how do we reduce the number of cars in the city centre? How do we make it alternative ways of that kind of last mile of transportation, and then that allows us to free up space and convert some of the spaces that are currently roads into usable public realm. So I think that that's definitely something that can be done if there is that kind of the will to push ahead with it. But given the amount of urbanization that's happening, the speed of development, I think this is something that definitely, in the future should be considered here.
I guess, what is the percentage you gave to me at lunchtime? We've gone from where 10 years ago to now?
Yeah, so in terms of global urbanization, so we have reached past the 50% of the world's population living in cities. And I think they're projected by 2050, it becomes 70%. So, this is a huge shift. Because 70%, with a 8 billion worldwide population, that's a huge amount of people living in cities. So, in order to have them actually living in a city, but still getting access to that, open space, to the landscape, which contributes to people's, well-being, both physically, mentally, it's very important to have that provision.
Are you seeing a trend in the master planning stage of residential areas whereby there is public space and gardens and private gardens? And is there a focus starting to be whereby private gardens are a premium, especially if there's a pool in it, but there is a bigger premium to play with open spaces that are being walked through? So basically, are gardens starting to be sacrificed at planning level for the betterment of the actual community, and actually the value of those properties stays the same or even goes up by actually having less garden space. Is that starting to happen?
Yes, that is starting to happen, and I think at a master planning level, it's actually a great kind of idea, because a lot of the communities that are being built now, so they do have, people want to have their private gardens, but the thinking is, okay, we could reduce the gardens. It becomes more of like a urban village, so to speak. So the areas that are not the part of the private villa, so there's actually less maintenance for the homeowners themselves, then those areas in the master plan actually used to create more pocket parks and spaces and outdoor recreation. So that actually also enhances the social aspect, because then the kids or whoever, they actually meet and make friends from other people who live in the community, because they're all socializing together in these spaces. And I think for a developer, it's also a win. Yes, there is a little bit more cost in terms of adding these outdoor spaces, but then the premium that it provides then retains the value, or actually increases the value of the properties. So I think it's actually a win-win situation for all.
On the theme of varied entertainment and more leisure, what are the new key trends you're starting to see particularly in the public realm, but public realm within private sector residential areas, of different types of sporting activity? Because certainly some of the trends that Jebel have been involved with, we take skate 4 or 5 years ago, there wasn't many of them around, and now Jebel is the biggest design builder of skate parks, because the demand, the expertise in-house has grown exponentially with the sheer explosion of demand of projects. Paddle courts over the last few years have gone bananas due to the global trend. So what global trends are we starting to see, or are you starting to get whispers for, that start going to affect the sort of activities we see in the public realm coming up in the sport area?
Yeah, I think in the sport area, so again, because of the the climate here, a lot of the sport areas they're more well used in the evenings, the winters, and so on. But like you said, definitely skate has been a huge one. A lot of the projects that we're working on, they all are demanding skate parks as part of the leisure amenities. Paddle has been growing a lot more, and to the detriment of tennis, I guess, which has been reducing. In terms of other kind of play trends that we've been noticing, actually a lot of the developments now, the master plan community, some actually going back to more nature-based play, so educational nature-based play. That's something that has been increasing as well. So I think growing up, we've always had a lot of these like standard type play equipment, different types of things that we would go on, but actually that experiential play, whether it's to do with actual water equipment that that you pump and you play with and you interact with, or using natural play, just recycling materials like logs and stumps and creating these agility outdoor fitness. So these types of elements we've seen more in the projects that we've been working on, and I think particularly for residential communities, I would say there are different waves of things that are happening. So more recently, I would say in terms of the outdoor leisure space, so people want to be able to go outside and to walk, and there's a lot of forest-themed communities. So whether they are with, let's say, the Gaff Woods or Until Al Gaff, some of the ones by Al Dar in Dubai as well. So there's that huge focus on that outdoor greenery and kind of forest living kind of space. So hand in hand with that, in terms of leisure activities, a lot of that relates then to how do we create this kind of natural play, exploration, something I think a lot of us take for granted in Europe or in America, where you can go out to nearby, there's a forest, or somewhere you can go and explore. But here it's something that needs to be kind of manually kind of designed and put in place.
I imagine that integrates, and that's starting to integrate these spaces even more into a broader age group. So often we've got segmentation of ages, but the nature of how you described that absolutely goes into the realms of wellness and calmness and thoughtfulness, certainly from an adult perspective, certainly in these forest type environments you're describing. So fitness and well-being and play are starting to merge a little bit.
Yes.
In that sense, is that what you're saying?
Absolutely.
Yeah. We spoke about sustainability and urbanization, and you touched upon Saudi. You mentioned to me that there was a real focus on keeping as much to the natural environment and land as possible, which I find staggering when it's like the 10th, 11th largest, biggest country in the world, or maybe even bigger. Is that in the projects that you've been involved with in Saudi? And I know you're more based in the UAE, but is that really what you see in these mega projects, that there is a real attitude of going up and inwards and really trying to keep as much land available to nature as possible?
I think that's very particular to NEOM with the line, where the approach was to have that kind of 5% on that line that's built up, and then the rest of it to be maintained mostly as natural as possible, creating, I guess, in terms of a high density kind of urban area that's interconnected, but then leaving the rest relatively untouched. And I think in a way, if we look at historically, if we take New York, if we take Manhattan, for example, so, we have Central Park. There's a huge, massive, open space. And then surrounding it, all around, we have all the skyscrapers, tall buildings, and so on. But having that huge central space, with the open park, that provides a lot of value for the residents, in terms of, the level of service that they get, having that easy access to an open space, compared to if we had more of that kind of suburban sprawl that spreads and you've got smaller parks dotted here and there. Actually, I think, with the population growth in cities, having a much larger open space actually, could be a better idea.
And I assume that's the real core of the DNA of the massive park we're building in the middle of Riyadh. To have the largest
King
park,
Salman Park,
absolutely, that's centralised. It's still those same principles. Whilst everything gets built and rebuilt around it, it's that same core DNA of how Central Park works in New York. You see it the exact same way?
Yeah, I see it in a similar way. I think in Riyadh, I guess the density is not as high, but in terms of the aspirations, I think it is something that makes sense. Similar to, I think in Dubai, I guess we have Mushrif Park, which is also very large. So it's having these kind of key open spaces that people can come and enjoy and really relax. Because at the end of the day, having play spaces, and so I think there's a different level of kind of play spaces that we have. So if you live in a villa community, you want to have somewhere nearby. The kids they can go and play, they can enjoy, meet their friends, and that's something more local. And then perhaps something on the weekend, you want to really get immersed into the countryside, somewhere where you disconnect, so you can go to somewhere bigger like Mushrif Park. So looking back, when I was in the UK, I was in the southwest. I was in southwest London, and then we'd oftentimes go to Richmond Park, for example. And then because it's so big, once you're inside, you feel totally disconnected. You see other people walking around, but it's just a pure park in that sense. You don't see buildings, you don't see any other kind of urban elements as such. So I think it's important to have those different scales of open spaces, to give that variety as well for the people who live here.
On variety, do you think there'll be more and more of a blur with private leisure enterprise? So on Saadiyat Island, there's a operated ropes course.
Surf
exactly, yeah. So in terms of differing combinations, different spaces, these spaces need to do more. So rather than necessarily having a big open space that does one thing and a certain other space over there, is there an economies of scale where you've got to accommodate more in more of those spaces? And to do that often requires something quite intense in a small space. Like, a surf park isn't small, but it comes with a certain cost, but it also comes with a certain level of experience that must be operated. Are we going to see more of that in what you would ordinarily have expected, just an unstaffed space? Are we going to see more combinations, do you think?
I think so. I think because at the moment, so if we take Abu Dhabi, for example, we've got let's say on Yas Island, you have all the various theme parks and things which are all ticketed. I think there is a value to where you have larger and relatively public parks, and having perhaps some private investment or certain activities which are ticketed that actually draw in more people, bring in more crowds, and also increases that kind of play value, and people return more often as well. So I think there's definitely some kind of, I guess there's some synergies that can be made with like public-private partnerships in that sense to further expand the activities. Because we worked on a project with Dubai Municipality last year, and we were looking at a number of parks for them as well. Some were new, some were refurbished, existing parks. But as with all things, there's always a budget. So to be able to actually put more content into the park, more themes or more kind of entertainment. So we were looking at ways of how do we actually help the park generate revenue. So from simple things like maybe there are food trucks, or maybe there could be, like you said, themed attractions or other things. So I think there is something that could be looked at in here in terms of that kind of partnership to to expand upon those.
Would it? I imagine, and this is a particularly interesting question here, because you always assume that budgets are often not the challenge, but they are. I mean, budgets always can curtail design. You still have to work as hard as ever to make sure that philosophies are delivered. I wonder if that cross-pollinating with private business here could happen more here, because people are wanting to do more and more activities as a demand grows, where actually these projects can perhaps be done on a bigger scale with private business. It's not how it's done, but it could perhaps become so, and maybe in some areas it is. I wonder if you see that starting to happen. Yes,
and I think that could happen, because here there is I always say, compared with maybe some other countries, there's also let's say a slightly higher disposable income. There's more appetite for these kind of ticketed, perhaps kind of entertainment and leisure. So it is something I think that could work here, and then it'll just be in terms of partnership between the private entities that run these and with the government, in terms of how they work out in terms of the leasing or the land, and I think that's something that could bring a lot more value as well.
Is there, from the digital world affecting the physical world, there has been geocaching and other things around for a long time now, whereby actually you can make, particularly from a children's point of view, you can make a route or something else exciting because they have to go and find treasure, or they go and find a angry bird or whatever it is. With wearable tech now, and then the release of, I think it's Meta's latest goggles, are you starting to see more and more, or can you start seeing an element whereby actually the digital world is going to become a lot more relevant again in a much bigger way than geocaching was, where perhaps geocaching was starting to activate, particularly on perhaps some lower budget projects where you couldn't necessarily involve lots of things, or even if there are elements of equipment laid out, whether it's fitness, play or skate or otherwise. Actually, wearable tech and tech in general, is it going to merge those two worlds in a really interesting way? And could that affect how you start designing spaces?
I think so. I mean, there were things that we were looking at a concept stage when we were looking at these parks with the municipality, and we had some kind of really interesting ideas at the start how digitally the parks could be connected. So, for example, there could be particular activities and events, and there were scoreboards there, and then what the children were doing and playing in one park would be reflected then on the scoreboard in another park. And you can actually, even though you might be kilometers away from each other, there's actually in that kind of level of interaction going on. So I think, yes, with the digital and the physical world, there's lots of interesting things that we could incorporate. How do we bring that kind of technology into the parks? And that's definitely something that I think over the coming years will become more and more prevalent in these parks.
So with coming back to Icon, the Icon's going great guns, and it's lots of growth happening in the business, and that's a big reason why you joined, right? And you've been a big part of helping that grow over the last number of years. The 2 or 3 key areas that you're seeing that business is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger in the sort of the landscape world in general. What are you seeing?
So I think it was a great time when I joined Icon, actually. So I joined kind of mid 2022. At the time, the team was around 70, just under 80 strong. And now now in 2025, we're at around 200 employees. So, we've definitely grown in leaps and bounds over the last few years. Type of work that we've been doing, we've been picking up larger projects as well. Varying from large scale master plans with private developers to actually like Emirati housing projects. And I think with all the various clients, it still boils down at the end of the day is how do we get that creativity and how do we get that differentiation in the design? Because what we don't want to copy and paste. So when we work on these large residential communities, a lot of what we're looking at is there is a communal kind of thread or a theme through it to give that kind of continuity of the project. But how do we customize or look at different spaces, what they provide, and then how that can service the community? So it again goes back to that looking at the demographics of a place. What do we need to provide? What should we provide? Are we catering? Is there enough provision of certain things? So it's almost a bit like a jigsaw puzzle in a way sometimes, where we look at, okay, these are the kind of requirements that we feel that these parks or these open spaces should have to service the community. Obviously, we have what the client, what they want as well, in terms of inputs and the ideas, and then how we blend that together and distribute that in an equitable way. Because I think one of the things is when you look at a residential community as a buyer, for example, you also look, okay, where's the nearest park and what activities, what can be done. And so even in certain master plan communities, so villas that are next to the play areas, they actually have a bit more of a premium compared to those slightly on the edge or on the outside where it's further away. So again, a lot of us being involved early on at the master planning process also helps with this provision as well. So understanding or helping to decide where should these particular things go and why they should go in certain places.
It's the more one discusses the past, it's about projects that have distinct identities, and then trends can move it from one to another in terms of the value of a space, health, well-being, leisure, commerce. Then as the years go by, the trends will slightly differ and change, but it still comes down to the drive for more creativity, more uniqueness, whether it's a residential area or it's a commercial themed attraction space or otherwise. The drive for technology makes us all able to do more things more quickly. And we spoke about AI at the beginning, and perhaps we touch again on it here, is that for AI to be sustainable and to continue, it has to be something which you can't do without. And I would suggest that particularly in public realm landscape design and the lives in which we live in that outside recreation space, the future for it is more creativity, not more standardization. And so for things like AI to enable design and for us to get more creative, AI inevitably, if it's going to exist and survive, will need to aid us being even more creative. So I would imagine that based on that equation, we will use it more and more and probably more quickly than we need to, and it'll be involved in everything. But it's how you get more and more creative, isn't it? So the thinking has to rise to the top. So all of these spaces have to evolve their unique identity even quicker than they've ever done before. So master planning has got to be even more creative than it ever has done before. And that's probably where I think that's where everything's going to accelerate. And you'll be able to get involved much earlier because the technology is going to be able you to do that. And you're going to have to be even more creative because you've got more time to be more creative, but it's going to be even a bigger element of competitive advantage than there ever was before, because everybody else will be doing things more quickly. So it probably is a good future for the creative and not one to be feared of. You've just got to be the most creative.
Embrace it. And I think, embracing it, understanding it to make the most of it. So it's to not let anything, like whether it's AI or whether it's a program or, not to let that limit the creativity, but see how that particular thing can actually aid the creative process more. Because I think at the end of the day, we want to, a lot of us, if not all, we are embracing AI. We are using it in our, day-to-day workflow, but it's how do we get the most of it, but don't be limited by it. And I think that is one of the key kind of drivers.
So, and this perhaps we can round up here, because I think we've gone through some really exciting, provocative thoughts in terms of urbanization, some of the crazy population growth curves. To make it a space we want to live in, we're going to have to work even harder to make it creative, whether it's up high in the sky or down below. And then how AI can help us do all of that and everything in between. So I think to finish off, it's going to be and I mentioned at the beginning, name a couple of the craziest ideas as you live in Dubai, that has been thought of in Dubai, and what's the most likely to stick and happen, or B, the most fun that would stick and happen. And I think there was two we spoke about in my language, which was the new town area that would be completely covered in glass, and it'd be a city in which it keeps at 23 degrees, but you'd be outdoors, indoors, or the city in the sky that surrounds the Burj Khalifa.
I think out of those two ideas, for me, I think the one where actually more like that kind of Eden Project dome and where it's covered, that is something that would really bring people outdoors year round, although technically it's become indoors. But I think that is something that maybe is more one of the wild ones that is more likely. I think the one around the Burj Khalifa, that huge kind of loop, probably remains more in fantasy at this stage. But, with Dubai, you never know, right? So I think at the end of the day, anything that really helps in terms of being able to, particularly in this part of the world, being able to bring the people, outdoors and actually to use the spaces to socialize, to exercise and be healthy and so on, moving away from that heavy, car-centered kind of development into something that is more in terms of pedestrian mobility, that kind of, accessibility if you don't have a car. I think that is something that will, as a trend, it will, push forward in the coming years for sure.
Awesome. Brian, thank you so much. It's been great talking about it, and let's do it again.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Rob.